Hi, everyone. I'm Steven Henry Madoff, the chair of the master's program in curatorial practice at the School of Visual Arts in New York. And this is the Curatorial Roundtable. Each week, I invite a distinguished curator or institutional director to speak about their practice. And as I was just saying to Kay, who is our guest today, this is the last of the year. Um, they'll continue, of course, next fall, but yay, Kay. So I'm just going to read a brief bio for Kay, and I'll just mention, as I do each week, that Kay will speak for about 50 minutes. The last 10 minutes are for your questions or comments. At the bottom of your screen, there's the little icon for Q&A. So just type your questions in there. I'll remind you at about 10 of. And so I'll just begin by reading this very brief bio. Kay Watson is a curator, producer, and researcher working at the intersection of art and technology with a focus on photography, video games, and emerging media. She's head of arts technologies at the Serpentine Galleries in London, where she leads programs that bring artists into dialogue with cutting-edge digital tools, infrastructures, and networks. In addition to her curatorial work, Kay serves as a trustee for the Brighton Photo Fringe, Mediale, and the Photographer's Gallery. Is that so? All of them? Yes?
I don't actually do Fringe anymore, but I keep things
Okay.
update. But yes, I am on the board of Mediale and the Photographers Gallery.
Okay. And Kay contributes to the development of the broader visual arts ecosystem in the UK. And with that, welcome, Kay.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I'm. I feel like there's a lot of pressure being the last. Like we should have a party or something. Um. Okay, I'm going to share my presentation with you. Here we go. Hopefully that is all
Yes, it's there.
seeable for you.
Perfect.
Um, okay, so what I'm going to do is I am going to tell you a little bit about my journey to being a curator, producer, researcher, all the archivist, all the things. Um, I'll quickly talk you through some of those projects, some of the early projects that were important to that journey. And maybe it's not just projects, but important moments or meetings or people, actually, because I think that there's been a lot of important people in this journey. And then to tell you a little bit more about what I do now in terms of my work with art and technology and research and where that work is going. Um, so to begin, what I wanted to do um, was to start with these kind of what I mentioned, these formative experiences and influences, and also to start with something that might be a little bit unexpected. Um, because my role, my sort of route through my career has been extremely varied, you could say. Um, I didn't study curating. I went to art school. Um, and I have come to my position now and the way that I work now through my interactions with a number of different fields, and that is through art. It's through music. I was a musician and a session musician for a number of years. Yeah, all sorts of things. Um, photography, architecture, and archiving. Um, and another thing that I will get to is also the importance of production in the way that I work. I call myself a producer, and a big part of there's a few things here. I consider production to be one of the most undervalued skill sets in the art world. I think it is um, much more understood in other fields. And in the majority of the work that I've done over the years, my role has been multiple as producer and curator, and I'm sure many of you who are here would say a similar thing. Maybe others not, but my route has been very much this kind of um, building and doing, and learning through building and doing. And an area that I specialize in now is around the building of teams and expertise around projects. So that could be an exhibition project, it could be a specific artwork, it could be the development of some R&D around a creation of like a, you could even say a product or an experience, but this can also mean departments. It could mean, whole teams in institutions, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So here I'm starting with just to be a little bit maybe unexpected, but this is the work of Kenneth Josephson. I wrote my master's dissertation on Kenneth Josephson, and he represents what it is that I love about photography. Photography was my route through to working with technology as well. And I think this is an important thing. A lot of people around I would say my generation, I've met quite a few people who this has actually been their route as well into working with technology is through the photographic. And what I've always loved about photography is its sort of multiplicity, a plurality of uh, it can be many things in many different contexts. So a photograph is a document, it's evidence, it's an art object, it is many of those things. And I've always loved that complexity and that slipperiness and that ability for something to be multiple things at the same time. And so when I did my master's, which was in history of art with photography, I specialized in the history of photography at master's level. My final thesis was on the work of Kenneth Josephson, who I think is a vastly undervalued photographer. If you think in comparison, maybe with others like the Lee Friedlanders and so many more of this kind of work, and his work is extremely meta, as you can see. And perhaps the most well known of these works is the top left picture, which is called New York State 1970. And when I was writing my dissertation, I decided I would reverse image search the postcard that he's holding, see if I could find it. And of course, I found it straight away. This is the useful ability of using reverse image searching. So I have this postcard at home, and I thought this was an interesting. It cost me something like 20 pence from a postcard seller online in the States. And just this kind of circulation movement of images, the shifting status of that image, was very important in the development of my thinking around various things. So I wanted to start with this one. And then this is some work at the Photographers Gallery. So obviously I now sit on the board of the gallery, which is a real pleasure and privilege to be able to do in terms of the governance of the organization. But about many years ago, about 15, 17, 18 years ago, I originally started working on the development of their archive, and at the time I had been working as an archivist for many years. I had been working on the development of photography collections for fashion photographers, particularly fashion photographers from the 1990s, who became sort of famous in the 1990s, who at the time, no one was really bothered about whether their work was being archived or preserved or any of those things. But at a very similar time, a lot of these photographers were starting to think about their legacy. And so I was working as part of the development of that. I was building digital archives, working on these sort of digital structures of metadata and all these kinds of things. And then I started talking to Katrina Slewis, who is now based she's in Australia, a wonderful academic and curator. She was the first digital curator at the Photographers Gallery, one of the first in a public institution in the UK. Actually, at the same time, the Serpentine, where I now work, also hired their first curator of digital at the same time. This is around 2012. And so my kind of early experience of this like shifting between thinking about the networked image, which is something that Katrina has written so brilliantly on over the years, and working on the development of these projects, is another example of this kind of formative experience of the sort of relationship between image making technology, internet, ethics of the internet, and so forth. So these are some of the early things I was involved with. Motherload, I won't go into these, but 1 terabyte of kilobyte age is a fascinating project which looks at the history of GeoCities, the very early website. And then the final one is, and this is an artist that I met much later. I was already at Serpentine, and I've been at Serpentine for 10 years now. Rebecca Allen, who another artist I would consider to be vastly underappreciated and undervalued. And the reason I bring her up is, and why I think she's so influential on my thinking, is her relationship is the way that she worked over the years. Now, I could do a whole 3-hour call on Rebecca Allen and her work because she's so fascinating. But as an artist, and very much, calling herself an artist in the 1980s and later, but from the 1980s, as an artist being positioned between high-level technology research. She worked at MIT Media Lab, she worked at Nokia, she worked at a lot of these different places at the same time. And so she was running research into a lot of software and mechanisms that we take for granted now. She's one of the people listed, in the development of facial motion capture and other forms of motion capture. She was a inventor, if you like, of sorts. And at the same time, as an artist, like developing her creative practice and her art practice. There was no place for her in the art world at that time. No one was really interested in art that was made with or about or technology. And so she sought out these other spaces to make her work and to get it seen. So she's well known for her work with Craftwork. This is an example. She was making this while she was working at the New York Institute of Technology, which is also a fascinating place. I was writing my PhD on this, but I never finished it. So one day I will write the PhD on this. And this is her working on some early facial motion capture that became music video and the identity for Craftwork. And so I think what's interesting here, just talking about how art and culture emerges in other spaces, is she was seeing, oh, there's the emergence of VH1. That's a vehicle where I can get my art seen. And I can go and make these things if I work in these research labs and I access these technologies and I learn these technologies. So I think this is another quite important sort of indicator of how I work and with who. And actually, we did an interview, and I'm staying in close contact with Rebecca, and that was an interview I did for the Serpentine website a few years ago. She's got lots of exciting things coming up. So I'll just very quickly talk about these things. So early on, I was doing a lot of work in different fields as a producer, project manager, and at the same time, understanding, we have the kind of internship structure. But for me, what I decided, and me and others who were working in a similar area to me, was to let's, create our own opportunities to curate projects from our position outside of the institution. So we developed, we sort of quite organically created a collective. It was sort of a slightly movable feast of who was in the collective at any time. A group of women who all have an interest in image making and photography, and um, developing curatorial projects that draw on kind of histories, histories of women and labor and uh, and various things like that. And this was kind of a key project for us. We did lots of different kind of smaller projects over the years, but this was kind of a key project for us, which was called Secret Agent. And we were highly influenced by an academic called Catherine Grant and an artist called Orit Asheri, with this title Secret Agent, as I alluded to before, this idea of sort of hidden labor by women or female identifying artists, or just actually just women in society, and the role of image making in that. In addition, just also thinking about sort of histories and how sort of institutional societal histories are built, and the role of photography in that. So in this show, it was a two-parter. We did a show at the Finnish Museum of Photography, and then we did another place called Guest Projects. For those of you who are familiar with Yinka Shonabari, Yinka has a studio, but a space in Hackney at the time, and this is about, I think this one was 2015, so this was about 2016 at Guest Project, so this is 10 years ago. You could apply to run projects at Guest Projects each year, and Yinka and his team would select the projects that were shown there. And so we created a version of it for London as well, working with a number of different artists. So here we have, I won't go too deeply into all of these practices, but international artists in this field, and creating kind of a touring show that went from Finland then to London. And this was, we were creating opportunity for ourselves, essentially, to be able to, demonstrate our research curatorial work, and whilst also be able to support some of the artists that we think deserve to be shown. An artist like Maud Salter, who has who was very highly influential in the 80s. She died in the 90s or early 2000s, and had kind of disappeared from the sort of contemporary art narrative or the photography narrative, and now, since this show, I mean, we're not, I would never take credit for that happening, but we were one of a number of people that was starting to really start to reevaluate that work. And she then went on to have a sort of a retrospective at Autograph, the Association of Black Photographers in London, and much more interest in her work now. These are some images from, I must say, as for someone who has worked as an archivist for as long as I did, I've not done a very good job of personal archiving my projects. And so I've used Google to find find some images of the project. So we worked with some fantastic artists, Yifuna, Sarah Beddington. The hand down here is an artist called Alexandra Domanovic, Matilda Tehaina. So these are some installation shots. And, when we were able to work in the space at Guest Projects, we did, a symposium, a performance evening, lots of programming around it. And from there, I was then able to work on the very first art night, which is it was a festival that sadly no longer is happening. It was sort of moved around different locations in London, and then eventually the last edition took place in Dundee in Scotland. Um, and I think this was sort of I've included this here um, from a kind of I've done a lot of producing and project managing of quite complex projects over my time, and we definitely worked. This was a one night only festival, and we created some quite insane projects for that one night. This is just one of them. This is a an unused London Underground station that contained a smell installation and by the artist Kujung Ah. A challenge, if ever there was one. It's just to demonstrate a sort of love of getting involved in projects that are extremely difficult to do. Um, in addition to doing things in kind of public spaces, um, uh, yeah, but a challenge. So I just wanted to include that because um, as a project, it doesn't exist anymore, but uh, it was this sort of shaped my expansion of my sort of production and management capabilities going into ever more complex projects. Um, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about what I've been doing for the last 10 years. Which, you know, when I say it, it's quite a long time now. Having been kind of an itinerant, moving around and doing sort of independent projects, freelance coming in, this has been a real shift for me in terms of really committing to developing and building an area of work that I'm very committed to. Um, I wanted to approach this here as coming to talking about Serpentine Arts Technologies, which is the department, um, as kind of my most recent project. So the as in its entirety. Um, it is also not something that I have done on my own. It is, and I think collaboration um, is key. I've never been someone who works on my own. I every single project I do is a collaboration. Um, and I wanted to show this as, you know, very much in the context of this is has been about building a team and a program from scratch over the last 10 years. Originally um, started by someone called Ben Vickers, um, who I worked with for 7 years at the gallery, but also the relationship between myself as head of department and my team, and also the leadership at Serpentine. All of these people make what this is. Um, but this has been sort of an experiment in holistic thinking about what it means to be working um, in the field of advanced technologies within the field of art. Um, and how does the kind of front end and the back end of these ways of working fit together? You know, what I'll come to that a little bit more in a minute. So what I'll do is I'll talk you through some of those smaller projects as well, some of the great artists we've been able to work with, some of the thinking, how we are structured as well, just to show how this has evolved over the last 10 years. I have always loved showing this as the first slide when talking about the development of the program, because I think uh, technology is, there's a huge amount of discourse around this, but technology is something that's very real. And we are not just talking about things that we look at on our phone or on screens. And this was the launch actually of an artist project that we did in 2019. And I'll talk about it a little bit more going forward. But just to say that I'm really, really thinking about the materiality. It's about our experience in the world, our understanding of the world. So not to just see it as this kind of as something that is purely digital, but it is about these interactions between technologies and the world around us. And obviously them having material impact and value. There have been a number of things that have emerged during time at Serpentine. So I've been heavily involved in these programs called marathons. I was a co-curator of this marathon in 2017 called Guest Ghost Host Machine, which was very much thinking about AI and consciousness at that time. Really interesting to look back on it now in the kind of post ChatGPT, LLM world, because it was a different time at this point. Plus other kinds of projects such as the Serpentine podcast. I worked on the development of Serpentine Radio. Some of these things still exist, some have ceased to exist. We're always, riding the waves of what's possible at that time, what there's appetite for, what there's ability to fund. And marathons were a really great experience where we would curate a day, 1 or 2 days around a theme. And the idea that these were events that were completely interdisciplinary. So we had someone from DeepMind with an artist or an architect. We had performance, we had music. It was, culture and its relationship to these themes. And it was also a great opportunity to build relationships with other fields, but also with artists that we may then go on to do other projects with. And I think this is also important in the way that I work at Serpentine, which is to develop these very long-term relationships with different kinds of practitioners, because we everyone always says, like, how do you have a show at Serpentine? How do you have a show anywhere? And programming is for me so much more than just a good idea. We all know that we're beholden to what we can fund, what we can operationally support, what we have the knowledge to support. And so often it's about really having tens, hundreds of projects sort of available at any one time, and finding that the constellation of things that means it's possible to then make it. Sometimes it's because the technology it's too expensive, or the technology isn't there yet for something that we want to do, or it might just be that we have there's a moment in funding, or we know that a supporter likes this artist or is really interested in this approach, and you really are that kind of sort of network. You sort of hold the network and are aiming to like put the right people together. Now, I always wish that we could support more people at one time, but we are everyone is limited in what they can do. So it's very much about kind of finding the right constellation of things to make something happen. And just to say, and obviously this approach to the curatorial is very production focused, as I've mentioned before. We are not We are very rarely showing existing work. We are making the work in collaboration with artists. So this is about where our knowledge as curators, as producers, as people with knowledge on, in my team, we all have a diverse array of knowledge. We don't all have the same knowledge. So it may be, we have this right kind of understanding in terms of intellectual property and machine learning. We're in a good place where we can support the development of this project. So this is where we are now. So at the beginning, when there were two of us working part-time on the development of what became arts technologies, we are the department formerly known as digital. I think that we changed our name because of what I said before about this work with technology existing not just in a sort of digital space. Actually, no, digital is purely digital. And in the kind of a museum context, digital, it sort of means a lot of different things. Again, it can mean marketing. And so we were very much shifted the sort of naming of it to think about it as a field in its own right, thinking about kind of research and across kind of the curatorial, but also in terms of making prototypes and projects and so forth. We also began thinking about, with a very open question about what is the role of technology in the institution of the future. And when we began, we were just working with artists on commission projects and productions. And then that evolved into something else, which is around what we called sector convening, knowledge production, strategy, policy, the ability to support experimentation and R&D, so early stage ideas, and to share that knowledge with our peers. So whether that is other institutions, other artists, and the way that this has also evolved, and there's some interesting things emerging from, and I say this very much in a UK context, and it is it's international in scope. We work internationally, but there has been a lot of interesting thought emerging around. So, for example, there's a British Council report that came out in the UK called Why Technology Needs Artists, which sort of seeks to, and this is quite a simple idea, which is, technology is not something that just happens to art. We don't just, there's a technology, let's use it to do a thing. It's already been decided what that technology is. Rather, is there, or I think, yes, there is a role for the arts. And by that, I mean artists, curators, producers, anyone in the ecosystem to examine and interrogate emerging technologies in dialogue with other fields that can impact other fields. So, and this is something that we sort of has been central to our work over the last 10 years, and then has manifested recently, and this is the last thing I'll talk about it with one of our latest reports. But anyway, here I'll just talk a little bit about the positioning now, which is our mission is to ensure artists in the art sector impact the development and implementation of advanced technologies so that current and future technological innovations benefit everyone in society. This text is new and a bit of an experiment, so you can tell me whether you think it works or not. We believe that artists in the cultural sector are not just users of technologies, but actually actively changing how technologies are developed, how they're used, and who has access. And our aim is to deepen this impact and create more opportunities for arts-led technological innovation through art and research. So, and key here is we collaborate with artists, technologies, researchers, and organizations to develop different kinds of projects, artworks, exhibitions, research projects, prototype projects. And this is about kind of, we know that a lot of technologies around is the narrative. And so, what are the stories or that we need to be telling about these technologies and the way they interact or they exist in our lives? But also, what's the material of it, playing with this stuff and like really sort of working with it and not just sort of thinking about it abstractly all the time. And key is supporting partnerships and collaborations between the art field, academia, policy, so that art and culture has a seat at the table. Now, I'm not going to pretend that this is we're there. It's a long-term project, and this is why I've been doing it for 10 years, and I will still be doing it probably in another 10 years as well. So time is disappearing. So these are some of the commission projects. Now, all of these have been commissioned and produced by myself and the team. I included this very first one here, Zaha Hadid virtual reality experiences. That was actually when I started, and we'd never done a digital experience in the gallery before, and this was our first example of that. And of course, whenever you do this in an institution for the first time, there's some learning curves around working with technologies because they break all the time. And so often you think, the opening is the opening and you're like, oh, it's now out in the world. But actually for so many of our projects, the opening is just the start of another phase where you're still working on the project quite significantly a lot of the time. And I'll talk about some of these projects that my own projects, ones that I was, and obviously I now oversee the department. And I would highly recommend looking at some of our more recent post-pandemic projects, which are Gabrielle Massan, Holly Herndon, and Matt Dryhurst, which very much shows the kind of relationship between research, R&D, broad impact, and at the same time creating a cultural experience that anyone can appreciate, understand, a beautiful experience that you don't need a PhD in machine learning to understand and to feel. And our most recent, Danielle Brathwaite Shirley, which is just closed, and this was an amazing project, which was about video games or video game technologies, or being a tool when it comes to bringing people together and really restarting this kind of dialogue in what is a very polarized society. Ian Cheng, based in New York, wonderful artist. The project, this is Bob, which stands for Bag of Beliefs. This was our first ever sort of major tech project in the gallery. So Zaha Hadid was sort of part of a paintings and drawings show, and it was a kind of a little element. This was the whole show. Again, so many learning curves. And in short, this was the creation of an artificial life form. Ian is a very, very interesting artist for so many reasons, but he really knows how to do R&D and development and build these like really interesting projects, really experimenting with our relationship with other forms of intelligence. And so Bob was the very beginning of this project for him, which then went on to be shown at a new version of it went on to be shown at the Venice Biennale, LA Light Art Space in Berlin. It was at the Shed in its sort of future form, which was Life After Bob, which was a kind of interactive film. Here, I don't know if Ian will like me for saying this, but because what we didn't realize, what working with AI and having a deadline, or any software for that matter, is a risk. And Ian, as we didn't know at the time, was having some difficulties with the functioning of Bob right up to a few days before we opened. And him and his team developed a whole new back end in about 2 days. And honestly, it was a superhuman feat to create this at that time. This is not a machine learning project. This is symbolic AI. This is an AI that learns as it goes. And we created this mechanism, which was only used in this version of the project, which was, and this shows like how things have changed from the pandemic. You could, at the time we said, you could Skype into Bob's world, and Bob was learning based on your facial expression. So the iPhone 10, as it was out then, had quite good facial recognition for doing this. And so Bob was learning based on your actions, and Bob could kick you out. And eventually, throughout the run of the show, Bob did start to kick everyone out of. So you would try to interact, and he would tell you to go away, essentially. We also had to feed Bob twice a day. And if we didn't, then things would go very wrong. So, I hope I haven't just frozen again. Have I frozen? No. Okay, good. Something weird happened. And so it became like a real lesson in caring for an artwork in a very different way. I developed quite a strong bond with Bob in the end, because Serpentine South has a central round gallery in the middle, and then 3 spaces on the outside. We closed off this central round gallery. It's kind of what everyone knows that space to be. That was our tech hub. It was the brain of the operation. And so I spent a lot of time ensuring that this project was running and working for the duration of the show. And another thing I'll say about this, having this mechanism of this phone, was it created a moment for, I realize I'm just talking and talking. It created a mechanism for our visitor experience, I think you would call them docents in the US, it created a mechanism for discussion between the audience and our brilliant visitor experience team working in the gallery. So it became a way into just talking about Bob, the way it works, what is Bob doing now? So it became an interesting kind of visitor experience mechanism as well. So because time is, I'll go for like another 5 minutes, and then if there are questions, if that's all right. This was a big open call project that we did. Now, at this time, AR had there had been some big releases that made building AR apps and experiences much easier. And a lot of artists were interested in doing that. And so we created this open call with Google Arts and Culture. So David Adjaye at the time, that was, what how can, and it's very much about public space and our location in the park, which was around, how can AR be used to sort of facilitate your experience of um, the public space. And so we had many applications and a process. And this project by Jakob Gutsteensen was selected, called the Deep Listener, which was kind of an audio and visual trail of the park, designed to sort of draw your attention to the kind of everyday species that you might not notice as you experience the natural work in a city. These are some of the images. So, this is from 2019. AR has changed a lot in that time, but this was like a real kind of experiment. And we produced it and we built it. We built the team. I love the fact that the opening, we did it in 3 months. And at the time, Google actually said they didn't think it was possible. But we did it and we opened, and it really showed that we had this ability to build software and software projects and bring the right people to the table. And that has formed the basis of a lot of the way we work going forward. This is the opening again. It was wonderful. This is the zone of bats, and people kept coming up to us and saying, "Have you put speakers in the trees?" It was a really, a wonderful moment. I'm going to skip through some of these projects because I could talk for a very long time. These are other 29 projects. This was an AR project that dealt with inequity and data collection and relationship between kind of the human and abstract and nature of AI at that time as well. Again, this is pre the sort of explosion of LLMs. Yeah, I'll move on. And these are some of the other projects we did in that same year. We worked with Jens Sutella on a machine oracle, which was based on, I'm not sure if you're aware that Cloudflare encryption has this wall of 100 lava lamps, and too much to go into now, but we were we created lava lamps in the shape of Jenna's head to manage the sort of divination. We worked with an artist called Suzanne Triester, who's also an absolute legend, making work with video games in the late 80s and 90s, also a painter and really fantastic. So, and this leads me to this other work. So the way that what we have now is this system where our commissioning and production and the working, getting our hands into working with the technology influences the other work that we do in terms of research and what knowledge we share, and creates questions that then go back into commission projects. And so we create this dialogue between doing research and R&D, and then creating experiences and projects and supporting artists to develop artworks and exhibitions. What that has looked like is a series of briefings over the last 5 years. Art and creative R&D has been our most recent, and this will be the last time we do like a briefing of this kind. We will now start to do more kind of papers that are focused on specific areas, because what we were finding that a lot of our recommendations and our insights were the same, no matter what the technology was. When we were looking at operationally and infrastructurally for the art world, our insights were very similar in terms of how can arts institutions, how can we really support and advocate for the arts in this space. And so what we've done is shifted from being a briefing, a report, to being what we now call an innovation hub, which is lots of different activity to to support art and advanced technologies for public good. And that manifests with building prototypes, supporting artists in other ways. That something new will be coming out next week that I can't say yet, but on there was a new program that will be launched that's been developed by my colleagues, led by Victoria Ivanova, who's a very brilliant curator and strategist and focusing on innovation. And so this is where we came to creative R&D, and we were seeing that this is our way of sort of defining some of the work emerging from art and technology practices as something that is research and prototyping led, that's R&D led, in the creation of different kinds of things. And that might be a product, but we're not saying it has to be a product, but we're seeing artists working in these very different ways. You know, Ian Cheng now runs a startup, but at the same time, still allowing for that experimentation, still allowing for artists to make art for art's sake, and not necessarily to always have to sort of, you know, create the next like innovation, in the same way that it's not for artists to solve our technology issues with technology, in the same way it's not for artists to solve the climate crisis. So, but that dialogue and that experimentation that comes from the art field is so generative. And how can we support that? We're interested in a lot of work that involves kind of governance and data and legal mechanisms, and so that's, you know, we do a lot of this kind of work. So yeah, and so going forward, it is about creating and advocating for the position of art and culture in different fields, and really understanding its impact and its value. Okay, I'll stop because I could talk forever.
I wish we had more time. It's fascinating. There are just at this point two people who have written. Sabom says, "Great last roundtable. Thank you. Do you think that artists will be the leaders in the new earth?" In all caps or initial caps. How can conscious artists best bring our consciousness to tech and AI? My focus has been bringing consciousness into the world. Is this enough? And then goes on to say, thank you also for pulling back the curtain and explaining some of the back end of things, where and how the decisions get made. Thank you for explaining how to follow the money. So the first question, again, do you think that artists should be or will be the leaders in the new earth? How can conscious artists best bring our consciousness to tech and AI?
Mm. Um, it's an interesting question. I think I just want to reiterate what I just said at the end, which is like, I don't think I don't want it to be that artists have to solve our ethical and all issues in society. Because I actually have seen, you know, even in the UK context, we see a stripping back of our education in schools context, and then, you know, the art institutions having to take on that sort of role in terms of developing the site of creative education. And that's changing a little bit now, but I guess what I'm saying is like, it's not what I'm trying, it's about more of AI and technology is a monolithic thing, and there are so many different things. You know, we try to break down the AI tech stack in our future art systems for project, which is like, where are these places where we have the ability to really interrogate and understand what is happening here. And we found that, at the point of data, there was really lots of really interesting stuff happening in the art context that's not just, oh, we need to know how many people come to our gallery. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And lots of artists interrogating what it means to like build a data set or to share a data set and all of these kind of things. I guess what I'm trying to say is we can't all work on all things, but where there are issues uh, and parts within this stack and within this constellation that suits that works with your experience and your practice. I think that there is a huge amount of insight that can be given in those areas. And I think it's for institutions and for curators within those institutions, but also others, not just curators, to advocate and to really kind of demonstrate that value. And I think it's difficult. So I think to me, it's like, how can you strengthen the ecosystem of all the different parts so that it's not just artists being singularly responsible for everything.
Mm.
I hope that answers, because it's a difficult question whether artists are the leaders of the new earth. I don't. Yes.
Yes. Let's just say yes.
Yes.
Uh, um, so the other question, which is AI related, after thanking you for the talk, as the technologies and AI are developing very quickly, and I believe that there would be more and more art projects involved in the use of AI, but at the same time, people might have some concerns on the use of AI or questioning the relationship between artists and AI technology. So I'm curious about your view on the application of AI in creating arts. You partially answered that, but
Yeah. So we've worked with a lot of artists who are interrogating AI technology. So with the example of Holly and Matt, Holly Hand and Matt Dryhurst, sorry, we worked with them on a project called The Call last year. And the sort of idea there was, what would it mean to create a polyphonic choral AI model? And so how would you do that? And how would you do that in a way that draws attention to kind of more equitable ways of engaging with AI? So from the collection of data, so big part of the production of the project was working with a series of amateur and professional choirs who were part of the project. And we worked on a kind of consultation and negotiation project. And in the end, what ended up happening is we created an autonomous, a separate data set, choral data set. We created our own data. And then we built a legal and governance system around that data set. And what's happening now is that Serpentine stewards that data on a sort of indefinite basis. So we were really looking at like the mechanisms of how the AI industry works now, and where can we do these kind of experiments that sort of show the potential. Now on another, so there's that, which is like you work with AI and you are really looking at which bit of the stack you're interrogating, you're building that yourself. And then there's also this sort of notion of working with proprietary technologies in the creation of projects. Now, sometimes that, I mean, most things use AI in some shape or form now, whether you're using Photoshop or to edit something, or whether you are making a video game, and these like little mechanisms. But I think through to whether you are, I guess the other side of things has been this sort of discourse around AI replacing artists, which I think is sort of a hype thing rather than an actual thing. But what does it mean to generate an image and for that image to then be an art object? And that does raise ethical questions. And what we like to do is to really examine what these different modes of operation are, and to look at it like from what are the difficulties? Why would you want to make this project? Why do you want to do it this way? What are the issues of doing it this way? So I think it's, I come from it from a, um, really trying to break down what it is using AI. So I am not anti working with AI because, but I am very, I want to interrogate why you're using AI and what it's doing,
Mm.
and what are the ethical questions around what's happening there. I'm so yeah, there are lots of different kind of versions of AI, of the application of AI in art now. And so, um, it's really interesting. If you talk to someone like Natalie Kane, who's curator of digital design at the V&A, and talk about what it means to acquire something that has been made with proprietary AI systems, that's a whole, it's so interesting because that's really difficult. And there's a whole part of culture that could disappear imminently as some of
Mm.
these AI models are closed. And because there will be no sharing of what those AI models were, that data that it was made with, or any of those things. And so we are likely to see a moment where um, culture may disappear from our, like, from the history, from the archive. Um, so yes, it's a very broad question, and there is no straightforward answer. But what I will say is interrogating the hows and whys is very, very important for
Mm.
me and for
Okay.
us.
There is one more question that just appeared. This is Carolyn Strauss at Slow Research Lab in Amsterdam, editor of the recently published Slow Technology Reader. Curious whether Serpentine Arts Technologies is working exclusively with artists already engaged with emerging digital tech, or also looking at definitions of technology more broadly, and to artists' artworks demonstrating alternative forms of, in quote marks, intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, we have done, yes, and actually, it's so interesting. Jakob Steensen uses the term slow media in terms of his engagement with technology, which is the idea of doing something that's heads up, rather than sort of. Yeah, this is why we changed our name from digital to arts technologies, which was to be able to consider technology more broadly, and for it not just to be purely digital. Um, we have worked in the field of life sciences before. We have been running a synthetic ecologies lab, which engages with uh, these notions of biotechnology and other things. So we are always very open to expanding the notion of what technology is. It's more about actually what experience and knowledge we have in the team that we can support. Um, but yeah, and we collaborate a lot with our colleagues. So we've have a ecologies team and worked with them on, that's been kind of important, this sort of more than human notion. So yes, there we are definitely thinking through forms of intelligence and other ways of thinking about technology. So yeah, great question. Thank you.
Part of that question, just to round it out, was Carolyn was asking, have you worked with artists who are, not just ones already working with technologies, but who are coming into I guess, the situation of what you're doing and therefore are engaging with
Oh,
your
right.
team in the use of technologies.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Sorry, I read that as like as more as people are sort of expanding the notion because we have worked with artists who do that. Um, yes and no. Um, we're obviously a small team, and working with artists who have no prior experience of working with technology um, is 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 harder, and it's very rewarding, but it's definitely harder because um, uh, it's a different way of working, and one of the barriers we often come, you know, we're quite good. We are good in this being the kind of translator between, people who speak tech, people who speak art, people who speak policy, whatever it is. Um, but sometimes fundamentally, the way of making in a technological mode can be quite different because of its non-linear. And so um, we create all of our resources to be used by anyone. So we are writing to artists and who more generally, so it don't have to be tech artists, but um, we haven't done so many of the kind of prototyping projects with artists who have never worked with technology before.
Hmm. Right. Okay. So with that, thanks so much, Kay. The roundtable is officially over for the season. We will be back in September. So we'll be sending out word in the late August weeks. And in the meantime, Kay, we'll see you in a moment on the other link with the students.
Yeah, and thanks to everyone who has been here, and hopefully it was informative. So thank you.
Right. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.